Welcome to our continuing series of Virtual Voices, hosted by World Information Transfer and focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our speaker today is Dr. Gail Gross. Dr. Gross is a nationally recognized expert in family, child development, and human behavior. She is a member of the American Psychological Association and frequently contributes to national and regional media on topics related to family relationships, education, and development. Dr. Gross co founded the Cuney Home School with her husband and led a landmark study on stress reduction in Houston schools. She has received numerous awards, including the Spirit of Freedom Award from the Dalai Lama and the Jung Institute Award. Dr. Gross authored several books, including The Only Way Out is Through and How to Build Your Baby's Brain, both of which have received significant accolades. She holds advanced degrees in education and psychology from the University of St. Thomas and the University of Houston. Over to you, Dr. Gross.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Well, I think now that everyone is up so nice and early, it might be time to talk about children because we really do send them off in the morning to a school hoping that they're getting our values and our feelings of ethics and morals. And yet we don't really know, do we, unless we go there, what really is being transferred to our children and what they're taking with them the 8 hours that they're away from us. David Elkind, a very famous author and psychiatrist, wrote The Hurried Child and the Miseducation of the American Child. And both books talk about this culture that we're living in right now and how we rush children into adulthood. We have this over-sexualized attitude towards children in schools. We have the over-sexualized attitude towards children in the media, in print media and television. And so children are really being pushed to grow up too quickly, and they're feeling, this feeling of being a child when their responsibilities or their attitudes are organizing towards adulthood. And there's a schism in the way they feel that many times they feel strange and uncomfortable and even guilty for the feelings that are being pushed upon them so early and without the coping skills to deal with them. And I think, we need to begin at the beginning. We need to recognize how important parents are to children. It's as simple as that. When we are born, we have a certain amount of genes, approximately 27,000. But not all of those genes can express themselves. So you may ask yourself, what makes our genes, what genes get selected to express themselves and which are suppressed? And the genes that are selected to express themselves are the genes that are stimulated by the environment. So if a parent takes that idea to heart and organizes an environment that stresses the genes in her child that she would like to see and suppresses the genes in her child that she does not want to see, she really goes a long way in helping her child develop in a healthy way that works with her particular family, holding her values, her morals, her ethics. So if parents don't take early childhood seriously and create an environment for their child that stimulates the attitudes that they want in their child, then the environment will haphazardly make that decision. And it's as simple as speaking to your child and bonding with your child. I once had a critic say to me, well, you're big comeback is bonding, and that's true. Bonding is everything. If a child is well bonded by a mother, a primary caretaker, and father, then that child does better at everything because it's more secure. It's a child that looks out at the world and feels that it can explore it. When you have your child crawling on the kitchen floor, your child will look back to see if you're there, which will give it a sense of comfort and security, and then it'll keep on crawling and go forward. And then the need for two parents is seen in that one little snapshot of a crawling baby, because father, by the nature of his genetics, will say, and his biology will say, let Junior crawl a little further. Don't be afraid. And mother will say, be careful. We don't want Junior to fall or bump into something or hurt himself. So baby needs both. It needs the courage of father and the protection of mother to be a healthy child and a good little explorer. And by exploring, it grows and develops. You know, every step forward is a step for enhancement of one gene or another. For example, say you have a shy child. We now know that we can see shyness on an MRI or a CAT scan. We can see the part of the brain that has to do with shyness. So if you know you have a shy child, and if you're with your child, you usually can tell if they're comfortable when other people are around, or if they nuzzle in your neck or push back or get fussy, crying, etc. when strangers are in their purview. Then you can approach your child and help your child over the shyness. And believe it or not, you can actually take a shy child who's genetically oriented towards shyness and make that child less shy. Will your child be pro-mesta? No. But will your child be functioning and able to cope with other people and not feel threatened or fearful? Yes. And you'll actually see the changes in the brain almost within a few years. Almost by the time your child is ready for school, you'll see a child that is functional and able to interact comfortably with other children. So that's a little example of how you can look at all these genes and make a difference, how you can look at all these genes and change your child's genetic programming. And then, of course, we have this other thing called epigenetics, in which we also stimulate certain new attitudes. For example, altruism. You know, altruism is not really built into us, but we can learn it just the way we learn empathy. And when you think of so many problems that we have in the world with bullying and how many problems children have with bullying, if you knew that something so simple as empathy can actually be taught, you realize that if we focused on things like that, we would change the world by changing a child, one child at a time. So the idea of being able to see the outcome on the technology we have today is kind of amazing. And the other thing that we know is that first baby in, our baby in utero is not just like a little pea plant. It's actually a little human. And from the 4th month in utero, your baby's learning a complete language. And so if we recognize that, we can influence even the baby in utero. If mother is calm, if mother is happy, if mother is dealing with stress, then baby is calm and happy and able to cope with stress. But if mother is not happy in her job, not happy in her marriage, not happy, period, and she feels stressful, the cortisol or stress hormone, one of the stress hormones that impact mother when she's stressed, will actually cross the placenta. And when it crosses the placenta, it's highly charging your little baby in utero and making your baby basically on high alert. When that baby is born, if the stress of mother is sustained, then baby seems to have ADD or ADHD, but not really. It's just on high alert because it's been over bathed in cortisol in utero. So we can affect so much of how our baby grows, not just by impacting him or her in school later in time, but right from the beginning in utero. And everything has to do with the environment we create. And it's not complicated. It's as simple as singing to your baby, talking to your baby, bathing your baby, stroking your baby. It's all the things we know naturally. But in our culture today, we've outsourced all these behaviors to experts. We're the expert because we're the parent, but we've forgotten that. And we are the first thing we want to do is put our child in this very good nursery school or whatever to teach them academically. But what they really need is bonding. And if a parent recognizes that, then regardless of her income, regardless of her job, because everybody works today. But when we do work like that, we have to compensate for time away with our children by focusing on them when we return home. That compensation will help your baby become a more secure, healthy human being who can use more of their potential because they're confident and therefore competent. So my husband used to have a sentence with our children, who we are to be, we are becoming. And that really is very true in early childhood development. And talking is a primary tool that helps your child develop. And it has an impact on IQ. You know, complicated language helps your child create what we call an associative mass. So they're building more connections, more synapses in the brain by the more complicated the language we use with them. So many times we use a nursery school because we must, we're teaching or working or whatever we're doing in our life. And so our children are being calmed, and the main object of the teacher in the nursery school, who has 20 little children there, is to keep everybody calm, to keep everybody happy, and to keep everybody basically quiet. But that's not what your child really needs. Your child needs stimulation and interaction. And it needs stimulation and interaction from a dominant or parent substitute while your child's in a nursery school. So I suggest that you really check out where you put your children. Make sure, watch a few sessions in the classroom. Make sure this nursery school is interactive. In the nursery school you place your child in. Make sure that it teaches your values, it teaches your ethics, your morals, and notice how your child feels in that environment. Don't just leave your child there. Get your child used to this environment and make unannounced visits to see what's going on in that nursery school. And if it doesn't work according to your desire, move your child to someplace else. Don't just hope it gets better. We are really the gene therapists for our children, and we have the capacity to make the difference. But we have to take that role back. We can't give it up and outsource it, because nobody looks after your child the way you do. And when we detach too early from our children in general. In Africa, for example, a mother may have her child with her wherever she goes. And by taking her child with her wherever she goes, her child is being socialized and culturalized and learning how to interact with others just as mother does, in using mother's language, so developing his or her language skills, and having tremendous growth in intellectually because baby is secure in mother's, wrapped around mother, either on her back or in front of her in a little sling. And that child that is secure is learning 100% all day long. So what we want is we want the brain to be used like an orchestra. And if your baby is calm and secure, then it has the opportunity to use the brain like an orchestra. And, you know, when we put electrodes on the brain of people in an orchestra, we see that pretty soon they're all playing, their brain waves are all in sync. They're all playing different instruments, but their brain waves collectively move in sync. And that's what you want with your child. You want your child to use all of its brain, not just part of its brain. You want your child to fulfill its potential, not just get along. And so it takes focus from mother and father. You know, in the beginning, baby doesn't even see mother as something separate from herself or himself. Baby sees mother as an appendage. And that's my mother. That's why when baby number 2 comes along, baby number 1 is jealous because they're possessive of that person that they think is an appendage of them. That's my mother. That's my father. And therefore, they're not comfortable seeing mother share her time with another baby. And this is where we begin sibling rivalry, which can be deadly, as we all know. So it's very important to give baby that time so that they have enough attachment, that they are secure enough to not mind when mother takes the new baby onto their lap. Because now baby number 1 is ready to push off, ready to be independent. And that also has a lot to do with spacing our children. If you don't have one on top of another on top of another, your babies have a chance to have been well bonded with you. And honestly, bonding is everything. And if you have time to give your child, it's the most precious gift you can give your child. Because at the end of the day, babies weren't meant to be in utero for 8 or 9 months and then birthed and then placed in a separate room in a house where you're not, after having been with you, with the feeling of you, the smell of you, the sound of you, learning your language in utero. So when we separate so quickly from our children, they're anxious and they have no sense of time. So they feel abandoned. And this is one problem that seems so little because our culture is all about detaching from our children very early, putting them in their own room, putting them in their own crib, and you having a different room. But actually, it's not normal to our species. And not only is it not normal to our species, but it creates a tremendous amount of anxiety in our children, which is why they're fussy and having a problem going to sleep. And I know parents have tried many, many things to make their children sleep. But if you let your children stay with you for a little while and stay with that attachment, then they automatically close their eyes when they're tired, go to sleep when they're tired. They're not afraid. They're not anxious. They don't feel that they're going to be abandoned. Same thing with taking your child to a nursery school. You want them to feel confident that you're going to return. And so you have to talk with them and tell them you're going to return. Give the nursery school teacher your picture so your baby can feel comforted, if possible. And in the best of all possible worlds, as Candide said, it would be wonderful if we had next to our work a nursery so that we could check in on our baby when we took a coffee break, when we had lunch. And these things allow the baby to get practiced and to realize the mother is coming. She's going to come in her coffee break. She's going to come at lunch. So baby doesn't feel frightened and abandoned because you've created a habit. You've made a track in its little brain. And that track says, mother's going to be back. And the most important thing is for you to be dependable. And if you say you're going to be back, so that they get to recognize that they can trust you. And that's very important in child development. If your child can trust you, then they can trust the outer world and they can trust themselves. And you've lowered automatically the anxiety, which causes the stress, which actually, the stress that causes the anxiety, which actually is the biggest deterrent to healthy development. Just like stress is a terrible deterrent for health in an adult, it's really a deterrent for development in a baby. And babies have a lot of stress. And if we meet their needs simply without being afraid of spoiling them, you really can't spoil a little baby. If they're crying, there's some reason they're crying. They may be hungry, they may be wet, they may be fearful. If you comfort them, if you meet their needs, then you help them develop the ability to cope without you. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to create a strong little person, a human being that can cope in the end without you. And so building confidence is one of the most important things we can do. Even in language, complicated language is building that associative mass. But if for example, mother spoke one language and father another language and an aunt another language and a grandmother another language, you could have a child that learns 5 languages simultaneously without any problem and without a foreign accent. But after the age of 10, if you try to teach these languages to a child, they become anxious, they become stressed, they don't think they can do it. And bottom line, they can learn another language, but they learn it with an accent, and it's not natural to them. When babies are born, when babies are in utero, from 4 months on, they're actually learning your language. They hear through a sort of an echo chamber, your voice, your rhythm, the meter to your speech, and they're learning words. They can hear you. And we can now see into the womb. So we can see that your child is reacting to the things that you're saying. If you're reading a book and you read it, the same book, and you read the same book the same time every day, when baby's born and they're fussy, if you start reading that book, they immediately calm down because it's familiar to them. They know this, they recognize this, and they recognize it in relation to mother. So they're comforted by it. The most comforting thing a child can hear is its mother's voice. In fact, if we made toys or games that used mother's voice to teach, baby would learn much more rapidly because mother's voice calms them and opens them to their potential. It's the stress that closes them down. And we think that babies don't have stress, that they're highly oriented towards stress. And so it's very important that we take into account that this is a little person and that they're not just a blank slate. We used to say tabula rasa, but no, that's not true. It's a little organism that's high-pitched to learn, that's really a learning machine, and it's learning everything during every part of the day. And you, as if you had a mixing board in front of you, can select by the repeating of certain behaviors what you want your child to learn. And you can also depress or suppress the things you don't want your child to learn. And when we go back to teaching a language, the reason your child can learn 5 languages, if they're being taught by different people teaching each language. You mustn't mishmash languages. You can't go from one language to another. But if you have selected people, each one teaching one language, then your child can pick up 5 languages, because what's happening in the brain is that each language is causing a track in the brain where all these neurons gather around that track. And these neurons are creating, by your constant repetition, a lane basically for that one particular language. So if you teach 5 languages or 2 languages or 3 languages, each lane is independent with its own group of neurogenesis, neurons gathering around it. And therefore, because you're not crisscrossing, different people are teaching the languages. That's how your child learns all those languages or anything. But you can't mix the tracks. That's the thing. And you have to be repetitive. And that is also so important. And then it has its great effect with behavior. You have a child that's misbehaving. The first thing you should do is change its environment. Many times it doesn't know why it's misbehaving. But if you change the environment for your child, then you've taken their attention away from what it is that's upsetting them or bothering them. And then, of course, comforting. Comforting is so important. Bath time, singing. And because we all have to work, when babies come home, when you come home with baby at night, it's important to do those things with baby that reassures your baby that you're not going to leave them, you're not going to abandon them. And then you can teach math. Children have really unique highlight moments of development. In my book, How to Build Your Baby's Brain, I lay out what baby learns at different stages of development. But if you're a person who ever just read Piaget or Erickson, you know that it learns certain moral things at different stages or ages, and it learns different development things. It has different development periods at different ages and stages. And if you tap into those ages and stages and take advantage of those heightened moments of development, then you can teach your baby different things, like even math at the age of 2, or reading early on without your child feeling pressured in any way, because you're teaching your child at the appropriate time of development. And so it's important to know your child, and it's important to know where your child is in its development. And it's important to take your child's development in hand, not to outsource it to others. And if you have to outsource it, for example, in nursery school, make sure the nursery school you placed your child in has your values, has your discipline model, has your idea of what children should be learning, and it's in sync with you, because you are the primary teacher. You are the most important person in your child's life. And along with that, now, if you develop a relationship with your child, on the weekends when you have time to be with them, you can teach them how to relax. You can teach them stress reduction techniques such as meditation, such as yoga, such as progressive relaxation. And believe it or not, little children respond very, very well to these things because they want to be with you and they want to be like you. And you know, Albert Bandura told us we are primates, we are social learners, we learn by imitation. So your child is watching you and learning by imitation and imitating you. So take advantage of that and help your child develop. That's the key. The key is you. There's nobody more important than you. And you don't have to do anything sexy or exotic. No, you just have to be there with your child. Be there to play with them or just be in the room. And so when they're on their little journey of exploration, they can look back and see and take advantage of quiet time and take advantage of teaching your child how to self-soothe, how to manage their own stress. The real problem in all development is stress. Stress blocks the even flow of development. And one thing I teach children, you can get my video for free on my website. You can get my meditation tapes for free on my website. All you have to do is download them. And children are very responsive to Qigong. Yoga is a little harder for them, though in my book, I teach you how to teach your child yoga. The Qigong is quite simple. It's just little movements that they can easily copy. And believe it or not, it has a soothing effect on the brain. And that soothing effect helps your children focus better. And therefore, by focusing better, they learn better. And the other thing is music. Take advantage of music. You know, Baroque music in particular, which is syncopated to our heartbeat, 60 beats per minute, which is just typical or average. It actually has a huge effect on the brain and helps your child learn better because it relaxes the brain and opens your child to learn. We've tried there are many studies on this. And I know you're all familiar, or maybe you're not, and if you're younger, but my generation was very familiar with Mozart and a mother who used Mozart music for teaching. But Mozart's music isn't the correct music. It's Baroque music. There's an old story about an emperor, and the emperor couldn't sleep. And he called for a person who played the harp in his kingdom, and the man came with a harp, and he started to play the harp. And the harp soothed the emperor until he could rest and fall asleep. And the reason the harp was important is not because of the instrument, but because the harp actually is used most often in Baroque music. And it's actually the Baroque music. But when you walk into almost any hospital, in the lobby, you'll see somebody sitting there playing the harp, because the idea is that the harp music in itself is comforting and calming, but it actually is the Baroque music. So when my grandchildren were born, my children put Baroque music in the iPod that they put in their baby's room. And on a very low decibel, they played Baroque music 24/7 for their children. And it had a wonderful effect, not only on their children, but on their children's development. It's really just common sense. Think about how you are when you're stressed. You can barely think. But when you're calm and relaxed, then you have all kinds of creative ideas, all kinds of aha moments and spontaneous creations that come forth. Everyone who invents anything, from Einstein to Edison, will often tell you that when they wake up in that quasi moment between sleep and awake, that's when their creative ideas or their problems seem to solve themselves. And so we not only want to have stress reduction for us, we want to have stress reduction for our children. And so if you get a little mat and you put your child on a mat and you on a mat, and you show your child what you're doing, you're going to copy you almost immediately. The same is true for potty training. So many parents talk to me about potty training, a thing that seems so natural and so easy, but it's really so difficult and can make so many problems, especially when it's stressful. Again, you don't want to do things that create stress. You want to do things that unfold in a natural way. So if you recognize that we're little primates, and if you recognize that our natural way of being is not to go to a restroom and go to the bathroom, but it's really to squat and go to the bathroom, because that's what primates do. But now we've been socialized. You know, Freud's great line, he said, the cost of civilization is neurosis, because we have to give up things to fit into our community. We have to give up things to get along with other people and live in a community. And so we have to be socialized. So we already know that the most important person in baby's life is mother, and then after mother, father. So we know that these two people hold the key to baby being comforted and secure. So if you take your little girl with you or your little boy with you to the bathroom and have a little potty next to your potty, and you go to the bathroom and sit them on their potty so that they can be a grown-up like you and do things the way you do, pretty soon they want to go to the potty with you. That's something you share together. That's your time together, special time. And the one thing your child has control over is its evacuation. And therefore, one reason we have so many problems with potty training is children withhold and then, of course, have accidents. And the reason they withhold is because they're stressed. So if you de-stress your child and make this the most natural thing in the world and something they can do with you, which is so special, special time with you, it's not going to be a problem. You'll be surprised how naturally it unfolds because those two things are what your child wants. Wants time with you and wants to be like you, to imitate you. Children learn through imitation. And so this also gets me to a major problem that we're dealing with today, which is what's going on in the school system itself, public school, or any kind of school. You have to know what's going on in the school. And so much of what's going on in a school is class by class by class, what's going on with teachers. And now we have teachers teaching children about sex in kindergarten and teaching children about all kinds of sex in kindergarten. And these things are very stressful to children. You're not ready or prepared for this kind of information. And this kind of information is very stressful on children. It's guilt-producing, it's uncomfortable. Think about yourself and the first time you were taught about sexuality and how parents had sex. I remember the first time I knew this, I couldn't look at my parents. I was so embarrassed. And at the end of the day, children go through these feelings. They need to be prepared for this. They need to be grown up a little bit before we tell them about the birds and the bees, so to speak. It's not something that they're old enough for. It's not regular for them. In fact, children are children. They live mainly in a fantasy land, and we need to support their fantasy. Their fantasies are their creative world. You know, we keep structuring our children and filling up all their time with stuff that they just have quiet time for creative play all by themselves for no particular reason. They develop in a much more healthy way, and they use more of their potential because creativity is who we really are. We're creators, we're co-creators, and we need to let our children have playtime that's unstructured, that's for no purpose, just for them to be creative, for them to use their imaginations, for them to have fantasies. But if we're putting them in highly sexualized clothes for little children, highly sexualized toys for little children, some of these Barbie dolls and some of these dolls that parents give their children are so highly sexualized, it's really too much for little children. They need baby dolls. They need things that work with their place in life, not to bring their place in life up before they're ready to be there. You don't want a child looking like an adult, playing like an adult, and speaking like a child, and crying baby. Because really, back to David Elkind, this is probably one of the worst crimes we're committing against our children, is making them grow up too soon, giving up their childhood too soon. We want them to have magical thinking. We want them to be creative. We want them to live in their fantasy, because what they're doing is learning how to be a person. Their conversation with their babies, their dolls, are all really behaviors that they're imitating from their mothers and their fathers, or from television, or from their teachers. And so you have to ask yourself, who and what do you want your children to imitate? Who and what do you want them to be like? You know, you're not losing any time in their development by letting them be children. Just the opposite. If they grow at their own rate of speed, develop at their own rate of speed, and have the full thrust of childhood, then they're going to do better at everything. They're going to do better at school. They're going to do better at thinking. They're going to be better at processing, socializing, all of the above, because you're making a secure child who's not being inhibited or pushed to grow up. And really, we have to stop here and think, what are we doing? What are we doing by having these people come to public school, nursery school, and over-sexualize our children? What are we doing? And not only what are we doing, what are we going to end up with? So when parents say things like, you know, in an older generation, my generation, kids put tax on school teachers' desks or seats. That was the worst mischief they got into, the worst. Today, they come to school with guns. And we have to think about two things that we're doing. We're interfering with brain development and impulse control. And when a child is highly stressed, it's overproducing cortisol. So what are the stressors pushing them to grow up too soon? Poverty. The child feels out of sorts with other children because they have not as nice clothes, or they are poorer, or they're being bullied or made fun of because of where they live. So these things are stressors. Then, of course, we have families. The most important thing of all is the family. And if there's stress on the family, financial stress on the family, many times the worst comes out of our parents. They can become abusive, and children can see before they ever walk out of their house or are taken to school, they'll see a drive-by shooting, or they'll see incest, or they'll see physical abuse or drug abuse or alcoholism before they ever begin their day. So at the end of the day, what is that doing to the brain of your child? What it's doing is it's having the child overproduce one of the stress hormones, cortisol. And what does cortisol do when it's overproduced? It changes brain architecture, and it changes impulse control, just like drugs do, just like alcohol does. And when cortisol is overproduced, not to bore you about how the brain looks, but just to talk about three parts of the brain. You have the amygdala, and that's where your emotions live, and that's where our primitive brain is. And that's where we have the idea of flight or fight. I'm sure you've all heard of that. And then we have the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of our brain, right to the forehead. And that part of the brain is what separates us from every other primate, because that part of the brain is our executive function, our critical thinking, our rational brain. And that growth, that size, that large size of our prefrontal cortex separates us from our relatives, from the bonobos and the chimpanzees and the gorillas, because we're apes, just like they are, but we're the naked ape. And so we had a change. And when we crossed out of the chimpanzee tree, for example, we had a change in our prefrontal cortex. It grew much larger. And that's usually the captain of our ship. And then in the middle, we have the part of our brain that has to do with our memory and has to do with our thinking. And now, when our memory and our problem solving. And so now, when we think of these three parts of our brain, and we're stressed, the amygdala, which is our emotional part of our brain, that part of our brain gets larger, and the neurons overproduce, and it gets larger, and it takes over being captain of the ship. And now we're thinking emotionally instead of critically. We're thinking emotionally back to what our cave brothers or the cavemen did which was flight or fight. If they saw a tiger, they either ran away from that tiger or they stood there and fought that tiger. Well, the body goes through this whole preparation for flight or fight. And when our struggles today are emotional struggles, the brain still develops, still functions in the exact same way. So the brain will get larger, and we will think in terms of flight or fight. Our heart starts beating more rapidly. We're overproducing adrenaline and therefore cortisol. And now even the blood draws away from our skin in case we are struck or hit or bitten, so that we don't bleed to death, or our bodies help us not bleed to death. And we start overproducing white cells, because if we're going to be in a fight, we're going to get an infection. And those same syndromes happen today. We do the very same thing today. Our body prepares in the exact same way for fight or flight, the way it did in the cave. So we've evolved much more intellectually, we're still not in any way different emotionally. We're still operating in a very primitive way emotionally. And what this causes is a change in our brain. And if we overproduce cortisol, the body can't be cut off at the neck. So our brain is working in concert with our body. And that cortisol is bathing our brain and changing brain architecture and impulse control. And the part of the brain that has to do with memory, that part gets more narrow. And we can look at the brain and we can see if we're temporarily dealing with stress, and therefore all these systems are a go, or if we are having consistent stress and then having permanent changes in our brain. You know, a woman who's 40 and in midlife and suddenly becomes depressed and doesn't know why, nothing's bothering her in her life. This, if we look now as we can with technology at her brain, we'll see the part of the brain that's more narrow than it's supposed to be at a certain age. And we realize she may have not been comforted enough when she was little, may have failure to thrive, may not have been bonded enough, may not have been stroked enough or loved enough. And it was consistent enough where it changes the brain. And that when that happens, it takes 40 years for that stressor and those feelings to make their way into the personality, but they do. And at 40, she becomes anxious with a free-floating anxiety, which ultimately leads to depression, and she doesn't know why. And if we track back to her early development, we can see she didn't have enough bonding, enough comforting, enough of her needs being met when she was an infant. So all these things that we do with our children have huge consequences later in their development and later in their life. Things that are so easy to manage. I haven't looked at my time. Have I over?
Yes. We would like to leave some time for questions.
Yes, I can go on and on. I'm sorry.
Quite all right. It was a very fascinating and very, very important presentation, which would benefit many, many people to listen to. But in the meantime, let's go to some of the questions.
Thank you so much. Very interesting presentation, and lots of tips that I jotted down that I'll take away. So if you had 3 things for the audience, lessons to really take away in practical terms, what would they be?
I think number one, I would say we have to bond with our children, to remember that your child sees you as an appendage. For the first 3 years, they don't see you as separate from them. And father is important too. And of course, even in utero, father is important if he talks to the baby, and the baby can hear and can see shadow and light and has a whole world going on in utero. I did want to say we've done twin studies, and twins even fight in utero, and they sidle up to each other, and they put the sacks next to each other so their cheeks can come together. And when mother laughs, they're happy and they jump off of the uterus. So I would say bonding, to me, bonding is everything. And so you want a self-actualized child. You want a child that can ultimately be away from you and be confident and competent. So you want them to be self-actualized. And therefore, you want to be their first teacher, their primary teacher. And when you come home from work, you want to know that during the day, they're in a nursery school that has your values, your ethics, your morals, and your discipline ideas. There are many, in my book, How to Build Your Baby's Brain, I show you many, many forms of discipline. But there is a particular kind of discipline which we don't like in our culture, but really creates the right structure for children. And that's the authoritative model, where you're the leader, and by being the leader, your child relaxes. Mommy knows. I don't have to make these big choices for myself. But it's important to teach your child how to make choices. And so in simple ways, it's freedom within limits. You make the choices and then give them the choice of the choices you've made. So if you have a child who wants to wear a particular dress, if you put 3 dresses that you're comfortable with, they can pick the particular dress out of the 3 dresses, or the particular dish out of the 3 dishes, or the particular vegetable out of 3 vegetables. You make the choices that you're comfortable with, and then they get to choose. So you're the leader, and then they are developing their leadership skills. You're teaching them how to make choices, but you are in control. That's what you want, to have a self-actualized, competent, confident child, because they'll move into independence smoothly and easily with your guidance. Children are watching you.
And how do you strike the balance between motivating your child to achieve their potential with limited and low levels of stress? Because I think, different techniques can cause more stress than others.
You are so smart, brilliant. Actually, motivation is the most important subject that gets lost. But it's so important that in our culture, in a certain way, children have everything. Even poor children are exposed to so many things. And so we have to focus on the basics. And motivation comes from you. This is how mommy does it. This is how daddy does it. And your child is a social learner, and they're learning all about you. You're teaching them how it is to be a person. And that's why you have to be careful where you put them in nursery school. You have to realize that the nursery teacher is spending more time with them in the day than you are. So you want to make sure that that nursery teacher has your values and approach to discipline.
We had a few questions come in from the audience around raising kids with vegan or vegetarian or restrictive diets. What are your thoughts? Have there been studies around how it impacts mental health or like their relationship with food, etc.?
Well, this is a political one. First of all, we do know that there are cultures that are vegan and vegetarian anyway, not necessarily vegan, and they do fine, but they don't grow as tall as other cultures. And when we introduce, we recognize in our being, in our development from the cave to now, that one of the biggest changes in our intellectual development came with the introduction of fire and meat. That when we ate animal protein that carried the amino chain that we carry as animals, that had an impact on our intellectual development. And so the thing I like to say is, if you're a vegetarian during the week, and on the weekend you introduce some animal protein, you have a nice balance. And there are certain religions that operate in that model, where you're a vegetarian during the week, and being eating animal protein is not necessarily meat. It can be eggs, it can be fish, but it does appear that the more plant-based our diet is, the better it is for our bodies, our health. And yet there does seem to be a need for some animal protein. So I like to follow that during the week you're a vegetarian, and on the weekend you introduce some animal protein, be it eggs, something like that.
Yeah. We talked about the importance of kind of controlling the environment of children. And these days they're having more and more exposure to information. So how do you recommend navigating that challenge?
Your questions are amazing. You're raising primary question for children. Parents have to stay involved. They have to know what's going on in their schools. Children are spending more time with the teacher than with you. That's what you have to recognize. And so early, now we're putting children in school when they're 2 months old. We have to work. So we put children in a nursery. But you need to know that nursery school, that teacher is following your program, your approach. And so you have to do the work, and it's hard work. And you have to make trial runs into those classrooms to see what's being taught, how it's being taught, what's being told to your children, because they're like sponges and they're picking it up. And the teacher is the substitute parent. In a gang, a teenager that moves to a gang, or an adolescent that moves to a gang, is just moving to another family. And the head of the gang is just representative of mother or father. So we are social animals, and we learn by imitation, and we need a family. And if we don't have one, we create one. And that's how cults develop. The cult becomes the family. And it's only allowed to become the family when there's something going on in the family that isn't supplying that security, that feeling that I know what's best, or I'm going to help you, or I'll always be there for you. You can count on me. And that's really important. As children get older, you need to be their advocate. And if a teacher does something in school, the question is not to your child, what have you done? The statement to your child is, I'm here for you. Let's go talk about it with your teacher. If you say that sentence to your child, pretty soon they're going to tell you what they've done, And bottom line, you'll know how to handle it. But if they're innocent and they haven't done anything, then you've shown your child that no matter what, and even if they've done something, you've shown them, I'm here for you. You can count on me. 100%, I'm your advocate no matter what. No matter what. And that message helps your child become a secure adult and self-actualized.
Thank you. And the importance of a family is a really important point. How would you recommend that families who are dealing with stresses and have to raise their kids as maybe a single parent due to circumstances, how can they kind of limit that impact on their kids?
I love your questions. I have created a model. You can get it on my website. You can get it online. It's called the empathic process. And it's a way to dialogue with your children that has empathy as its main characteristic. And what that requires is for a specific time in the day where you're not rushed and not using anybody's bedroom or anybody's study, so there's no power play in this. But I like to go into the kitchen The kitchen is the heart of the house. It's where alchemy happens, magic happens. You take flour, you take water, you make bread. So if you go into the kitchen, the heart of the house, and you sit at the table, mother, father, child, or mother, father, two children, and now each person has an equal time to speak. And they speak in a particular way in which they tell how they're feeling, and they don't accuse anybody of anything. This is how I'm feeling. They don't put anybody on the defensive, and they don't defend themselves. They just say, this is how I feel without any defense. That's the rule of engagement. And now mother and father have equal times to speak, and then you speak together to problem solve. And if you, when you do this, whomever speaks gets everyone's full attention. That means we look at them, we focus on them. And I like to tell parents, and touch your child, make a connection. Put your hand on their hand, or their hand on their arm, while you're making that connection, that focus. And now your child can tell you what's going on, and you can tell your child how you feel. And I also say, be very descriptive when you talk about your feelings. So don't just say, it hurts my feelings when you, instead say, when this happens, I feel as if I'm stepping in an elevator and losing my stomach. Everyone can kind of react to when that elevator drops and you feel like your stomach drops, or any other thing that's literal that a child can feel a texture of. You're describing your feelings. By describing your feelings, your child can really step into your shoes, can really hear you in a different way. Because so many times when we're saying how we feel, our children tune us out. They're already planning their defense. But if you don't allow defenses, nobody can, the rules of this empathic process, no defense, nobody defends anything. We listen, we focus, and we have empathy for the speaker. We show empathy. We're holding them, touching them. We've opened up a space that's a safe space. And not all the time, but usually, not right at first, but in time, if we're consistent with this approach, then your child can come back and say, you know, Mom, I hear you. You know, Mom, I thought about it and you're right. Or you can come back and say, you know, honey, I can see I've been thinking about it. And now I can see where you're coming from. It opens that space, a safe space, to not be defensive, but to be open-hearted and intimate.
Thank you. Very interesting. This was such an incredible discussion. So I really appreciate your responses. I'll turn back to Dr. Durbach for any remaining questions and to close out. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Susie, for asking the questions. And there's a couple of questions, as you may know, that we have a lot of students from Ukraine. And so these questions are basically based on how can parents support the psychological health of children in areas of armed conflict.
Once again, I have the chills just from that question. Once again, this is very out in front of what's going on in the world today, and are really a huge problem. Mainly, we have to recognize that our children are being traumatized, and they definitely are experiencing horrible traumas. But what the most important thing to do is allow them to speak about their feelings, to make them know that you're there for them, that you understand how they feel because you're there in that world also. And together, you can come up with ideas that will help them feel better. When you bring your children into the conversation, for example, the empathic process that we just talked about, and they're invested in their own outcome, they're invested in what for example, if a child's having a problem and you ask them, what do they need from you? What do they need to feel better? If you bring them into the conversation and invest them in the outcome, even if it's a discipline problem, they're more likely to come up with a harsher solution than you would offer them, and they'll follow the behavior change because they are invested in it. So if you bring them into the conversation, if you are intimate with them by holding their hand, making a physical connection, and you listen to them, and now together you take that time to problem solve, you're lowering their anxiety automatically. And you have to remember, you have to take a child where they are. So if they've experienced a lot of trauma, that of course is complicating everything. And these children are all experiencing terrible trauma. So you have to come up with plans. Plans lower anxiety. They don't work necessarily, but they automatically lower anxiety because, as Aristotle said, action lowers anxiety. So, for example, when I was a child, we were afraid of the atomic bomb. And therefore, what did we do? We had class drills, and we went under the desk. And the desk was supposed to protect us from the atomic bomb. Could it possibly have protected us from the atomic bomb? No, it could not have. But did it give us something to do that made us feel that we were going to be safe? Yes, it did. It gave us something to do that we thought was going to protect us, even though it wouldn't possibly protect us. So we have to come up with, and this is all age appropriate, talking with our child in an empathic way and investing them in the solutions that they also come up with that would make them feel safer. And then we must reassure them in simple ways, spending a little more time with them before they go to sleep. If they're frightened, let them sleep with us. You know, there was a very famous psychiatrist, I can't remember his name right now, but his daughter got married, and she was the last child of many children, possibly 4 or 5. And before they walked down the aisle, he had a little conversation with her. And after the wedding, people all came up to him and said, "What were you talking about before you all walked down the aisle?" And he said, "She was saying to me, 'Thank you, Daddy, for letting me sleep with you and Mom when I was little and not making me sleep alone in my bed when I was afraid. It helped me. It helped me reach this place today where I can walk down the aisle and get married and be independent.'" And so that is the point. He was a psychiatrist. He knew children should feel safe in their own bed. He had all the information next to him, but he was also a father. And he knew his child was traumatized and didn't feel safe in her own bed. And instead of forcing the separation, he included her with his wife in their bed. And it was what she needed at the time. And so that's what we need to do. We need to be there for our children. If they need extra time with us, give it. If they need an extra story, give it. If they need an extra cuddle, give it. And mainly, try my empathic process. It really does work. Invest your child in your child's outcome. It'll give them a sense of being self-actualized and security. That's what you want. And remember, they're traumatized. Meet your child where your child is.
Thank you. This question is also from our students in Ukraine. Regarding your landmark study on stress reduction, what were some of the most surprising findings and how have they influenced current educational practices and policies?
Well, the last study that I did was in the Houston Independent School District, our largest school district in Texas. And I looked at stress and learning. And one of the greatest inhibitors to learning is stress. We're all familiar with test anxiety. We're all familiar with the impact of stress on the prefrontal cortex, on the body, on the brain. Nevertheless, we don't recognize how a person can be highly intelligent, have a very high IQ, and not be able to function successfully because they can't cope. You know, my husband also used to say, when our children were young, my youngest child is 55, so that, that should tell you how long ago that was. But in those days, the Bowery in New York was the place where homeless people lived. And my husband used to say, so many of those people have 140 IQs, but they're stressed and they can't get their lives going. And it's stress that's the great inhibitor of our day. It's stress, right from the beginning, the stress of abandonment with parents. Our culture in the West in particular, really creates early childhood stress because of our need for early separation that is completely abnormal. We detach from our children way too early. And so right from the beginning, we're creating stress in our children, in their sleeping, in their eating, and on and on. So stress has a huge impact on learning, and it has a huge impact on self-actualization, and therefore, and on brain development.
Thank you. That's absolutely correct when you're dealing with patients. Also, the other thing, another question, can you elaborate on the most critical activities or practices that parents can implement on fostering optimal brain development in their very anxious and troubled child?
Yes. You know, what is the most important thing before we even begin our approach is bonding, gaining your child's confidence, your child knowing that you're there for them, that they can count on you, and that you are going to guide them with something that will help them. But that the most important thing is not the behavior, it's them, that you're there for them. They can trust. If they trust you, they'll strike out, they'll take chances, they'll try new things. But trust in you is the most important thing. And now, if you, you know, of course, it's going to depend on what the problem that your child has is, but repetitive remediation has the greatest effect because we're dealing with the way we learn in terms of tracks in the brain. For example, Michael Jordan's father taught him how to play basketball when he was a little boy. So that's the track that he did repetitively. Then when he became an adult and he was this incredible basketball star, he wanted to try something else. If my memory serves me, it was baseball. And he felt he was a great athlete, so he could just move from sport to sport. But he couldn't move as successfully from sport to sport because the track in his brain was not baseball, it was basketball. And all of those neurons that gathered around that track were supporting baseball and stimulating that development. So the repetition of behavior is the most important thing we can do to change behavior. So if we are consistent, that's why parents must be consistent. If a child can count on what's coming next, now they feel, if they know what's coming next, and now their behavior has developed so that they can perform what's coming next, they feel confident and competent. And what you're trying to do is help them feel that. That helps them grow.
Thank you. And have you observed any significant differences in cognitive and emotional development between children raised on vegan diets versus those on omnivorous diets?
Well, I myself had a lot of diabetes in my family. So when my children were little, I removed a lot of sugar from their diet. So they just wanted sugar. You know, at the end of the day, everywhere they went, they were exposed to sugar, and they kept saying, my mom won't let us eat sugar. But ultimately, you know, that was a bad approach. Balance and harmony is always the best approach when we're dealing with food, because food is essential and important, and we don't want to develop a food problem. We don't want children to become bulimic. We don't want children to be anorexic. So we don't want to create barriers around food. I suggest, if you want to be vegan or you want to be vegetarian, do that during the week, but a little bit of animal protein on the weekend gives an open door to balance. And at the end of the day, doesn't hurt anything really, and shows your child that you can have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, without compromising the idea that mainly a plant-based diet is good. But if you don't have a health problem, you don't have any serious reason why you should just be a vegetarian, there's no problem why you can't introduce some protein on the weekends, where your child feels more in sync with other children, more in harmony, more in balance, and you're not creating any barriers to food, because you really, food is essential. It carries many, many, many other meanings other than just nourishment. It has to do with love. It has to do with denial. It has to do with so many things. I wouldn't make any problem with food. So if in our house we were vegetarian during the week, I would let our children have protein on the weekends. And the truth of it is, if they want animal protein during the week, it won't hurt anything. So that's my attitude is balance and harmony. Don't make a problem out of food.
Thank you. And I received this question a couple of times. So what is the best way to raise children in single parent families?
This is also a fabulous question. You know, at the end of the day, a family becomes like a little team, and the communication in that family is the key to problem solving. So you want to have good communication. If it's single parent because of divorce, that's one set of issues. You don't want to ever slander the other parent, but you don't want to be dishonest. So when parents when children are seeing that they have one member not there all the time, father perhaps, mother perhaps, then you have to be honest when they ask you what happened. Where's my father? Where's my mother? And you have to be honest without slandering. If father was so wonderful, why did you leave him? I mean, that's the question when you paint an unrealistic picture. But when you're honest and age appropriately honest, and you just say, you know, mom and dad had a problem together, but we both love you the most, and we'll always both be there. You're our child. That's a unique relationship that we will always be there for you. And you'll always have access to your father, or you'll always have access to your mother. And we work like a team. So even when we're in a single, if it's possible, it's not always possible, but if it's possible that we can share holidays together, that's wonderful. If it's not possible, then you have to make the best of what you have. You have to create new traditions so that the children feel a part of a new family in a way, because now you're missing one parent. But if that parent is living and you can have a nice relationship with them, a working relationship, and put the children first, then it can actually work in a very positive way for your children, because they're not seeing fighting, they're not seeing a destabilized relationship. You're seeing two people doing the best they can for their children. And that's the best of all possible worlds, as Voltaire will tell us in Candide. That's the best we can do. It's not perfect. Divorce is very hard on children. You can't paint and death is very hard on children. But you have to meet your children where they are. And you have to give them the tools. And you're the main tool. You know, if they have you and they have an open line of communication with you, and they can go to you for comfort, they can go to you for honest communication, so they trust you, they can count on you, they'll be fine. It's not perfect, but they'll be fine. Children, what you're building is that essential part of your children that's resilient. And resilient children are fine. They do fine.
I think that you're absolutely right. It's very important that they have the resilience to be able to cope with the vicissitudes of everyday life. Anyway, thank you very, very much for a very important and fascinating presentation. We had many, many questions. We were able to ask only the ones that we felt were the most pertinent. And we thank you for being able to come. And we will publish when we do your webinar. We will also put the books that you wrote and the information that you said that our audience can check on in order to get further information about what you're doing and what are the answers that you have studied for so many years. So thank you very much. Have a very good week and take good care of yourself.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm so impressed by what you're doing and I want to learn more about it, really.
It's a real pleasure to share it with you.
Thank you.
Bye.